Hello everyone. I want to talk about something called the Motte and PLAY-ley Doctrine. It's something that I encountered pretty recently. It was first coined in a paper by Nicholas Shackel in 2014, so it is fairly new in general, but at the same time it has been around. And what's so fascinating about it is it's based on this idea that you had these old medieval castles that had two parts. They had a motte, which is a raised mound on which you build a castle or a fortress, and then you have the PLAY-ley, which is a more open area surrounding the motte that is more loosely defended. And the idea behind the Motte and PLAY-ley doctrine is that in argumentation, people will take on claims in the PLAY-ley. And in the PLAY-ley, it's out in the open, it's the field. It's actually a nice place to be in, but you're kind of a sitting duck. It's not as easy to defend. So you make these wild claims that are in broad daylight that anyone can see, and it's kind of this really flamboyant display of often very extreme and hard to defend positions. Now, the motte is contrasted with that. These are claims that are a lot easier to defend, but they're not as attractive. They're kind of mundane. It's a lot weaker of a claims. And that's another way to look at it, is that the PLAY-ley is kind of like these very strong, very extreme claims, and then the motte are claims that are kind of weak. And the idea behind the Motte and PLAY-ley doctrine is that people within certain groups, you might have some groups of people some people within the group who are making PLAY-ley claims, and then as soon as they're attacked, people retreat to the motte, right? And it may be that an individual is doing this themselves in their own argumentation, or it might be that if you're criticizing a broader group, that you see members of group within the motte kind of cautioning or tone policing or downplaying or using their legitimacy as being part of the motte to defend claims out there in the PLAY-ley, or even to pretend that those claims don't matter. And as soon as we stop criticizing the more extreme, more fringe ideas out in the PLAY-ley, well, when left unattended, people kind of just start to move out that way further and further. And this Motte and PLAY-ley doctrine is interesting for a number of reasons. One thing to note about it is that it runs very dangerously parallel to the way that thinking in general works. And I think that one issue with it is that it's only being employed in cases where a person truly is stating PLAY-ley claims with conviction. If they're just kind of entertaining the ideas, just kind of saying maybe, but then that's being reinterpreted as this strong sort of doctrinal position, well, I think that's actually a pretty disingenuous application of the Motte and PLAY-ley, right? Because the idea is that they're essentially pretending that their original positions were a bunch of straw man when really maybe they weren't. But at the same time, it could be the case that a person is out in the PLAY-ley saying what if, maybe, and making some kind of outlandish, kind of out there claims in order to invite that criticism. And they want to go back closer to the motte in order to test the limits of what they're saying. They try to figure out a groundwork, figure out what you can agree upon, and then work their way outward. And I think this is a really natural way to look at knowledge. Even if you go back to like Descartes' Meditations, like the beginning of modern philosophy, he starts with I think, therefore I am. He starts with the most easily defensible and kind of mundane sorts of things that you can prove, and then wants to build his way outward from there. And this is the way that most traditional works of philosophy function, at least in Western philosophy, is you kind of start with what you do know, and then you're building logically off of these propositions, whether it's like in logical positivism, or even just in any philosopher's approaches. Usually this is how they're doing it, is they're going to start with things that are more easily defensible, and then they're kind of saying maybe, and working their way outward. Now, one reason that this came to my attention was I saw a person on Twitter, and gosh, it was months ago, so I am not really able to track it down, so I guess you'll have to take my word for my reporting of this, but it doesn't really matter who it is or what the actual point was. Just food for thought. But they say the alt-right always does this. They're complaining that this is what people on the alt-right always do. is they'll make these crazy outlandish claims, and then as soon as you criticize those claims, they kind of retreat back to something more simple. But this person was specifically claiming that because the alt-right is so cryptic, they're sneaking in Bailey claims, right? And what struck me is this idea that because people on the left so often characterize everyone as Nazis, well, of course they're going to see this everywhere, because they're going to take everything as being a dog whistle. They're going to take everything as being the most outlandish, extreme position it could be. So in any situation where you straw man a person, instead of acknowledging that you've straw manned them, you can simply say that, no, I didn't straw man you, you're pulling a Motte Bailey. Now, it's part of a larger umbrella called troll truisms, and basically what this is the idea that you have like a set of beliefs where these more outlandish claims that are harder to defend are naturally paired with things that are more kind of mundane. And the idea is that the more simple, easily defendable, mundane claim gives some legitimacy to the more outlandish ones. Now, I think that this is a natural occurrence with the way that logic works, with the way that knowledge works. The further out and the more specific and the more radical your conclusions get, the more pieces you need to have set up in order for that conclusion to work, and the more areas of attack it's going to be exposed to. And this is why, as things become more technical, we have to use more and more language in order to kind of cushion it and justify everything. So I think it's all very natural, and that's what makes the Motte Bailey doctrine so interesting. It's a way of looking at rhetoric, argumentation, and even knowledge itself that it kind of recontextualizes things in a way that might make you more cautious of whether or not these positions are being employed in this way that might be disingenuous. But I think what's been missing from this conversation is this idea of the maybe space, because that's what the Bailey really is. I see the Bailey as the Overton window, and I think that basically we do have a lot of situations where our argumentation is based on mots that aren't really mots. They shouldn't really be defended. They shouldn't really be seen as these unquestionable things. And sometimes I've found that the real Motte actually is the Bailey. And it's been a soft theme of my channel that I try to take the most extreme stance that I believe that I can defend. And on one hand, it is maybe space, but on the other hand, I've found that so many of the most popular beliefs in the mainstream are based on false mots, and very often I am attacking the fortress itself. At least I'd like to believe so, because I think that we can find better fortresses elsewhere in a way. So anyway, those are basically my thoughts on it. If you categorize everyone as Nazis, then you're going to start seeing it absolutely everywhere. And what I think this is reflective of is a larger phenomenon, which is similar to like the fallacy, where you point out a fallacy in someone's argument and say, therefore the argument's false, when in fact it may just be that, the fallacy is kind of just vestigial to the argument, or that there's a really kind of trivial way to recategorize the argument to make it not commit that fallacy. And this is why when I'm arguing, I used to, when I had first learned about a lot of these different fallacies and informal reasoning, it was really exciting to point out and name all of the fallacies all the time. And I've tried to steer more away from that, because in my experience, once you start naming fallacies and trying to apply them to people's arguments, you just start a whole nother next level argument about whether or not the fallacy applies. And very often, understanding these logical fallacies or having a concept of them, they don't seem to be very useful in practice. at least not when they're named. To me, I think they're more passively useful. I think they're more useful for self-reflection, and I think that having a general knowledge of them can be useful, and it is good to recognize them, but I don't think it's good to name them, because you're inevitably going to steer the conversation away from the actual topic, and then you're going to be just discussing whether or not this particular thing is an application of it. A good example of this is ad hominem. It's really common for people to insult people when they're debating them. Like, it just is. Like, people get fired up in a debate, it's kind of a release valve. And what often happens is people say, well, that's an ad hom. But, you know, technically an ad hominem is when you say that someone is wrong because of the attack, that the attack somehow suggests that that's why they're wrong. If you disprove someone and then call them a mean name or insult them, it's not technically an ad hominem. And I remember, like, this is like years ago, somebody called out Stefan Molyneux for calling something an ad hom when it technically wasn't. And Stefan Molyneux says, well, it's an ad hom on the argument. And, like, that just signifies to me how just, like, stupid this approach is. You know, it's like, rather than naming the fallacy and then making a conversation about whether or not this logical fallacy applies, it's good to acknowledge it in your own head, but then use that to inform your approach to the conversation, you know, without showing your whole hand, so to speak. What concerns me most about this Motte and PLAY-ley doctrine, and that it's been named, is that now people are going to avoid challenging the status quo. They're going to avoid really entertaining some of those ideas that are really out there. And they're going to see it as something that's always disingenuous when, you know, really, if we're going to be open-minded and think about things, that includes being open-minded out into the crazy space. So anybody who's interested in shifting the Overton window or entertaining any ideas that aren't very popular, you're already kind of fighting an uphill battle. You're already defending positions out in the open where you don't have the same defenses afforded to you as people who make more mundane, more kind of common or moderate claims. And that's why I see this idea of Motte and PLAY-ley as ironically being applied in really disingenuous ways that's going to have a chilling effect. So that's why I want to throw out this idea of the PLAY-ley as kind of this playful maybe space, because I think that that's very valuable, and I think that that's really the cutting edge of interesting ideas. So anyway, I'm going to link a couple of things in the description about this Motte and PLAY-ley. Yeah, I just think it's a kind of a useful framework to look into. Hope you guys found this interesting, and have a nice day.